Hey YouTube, this is Elk, and today we're doing Ask Reddit Narrated, Episode 2. What family secret was finally spilled in your family? When my paternal grandfather died, the federal government reached out to do a state funeral. He'd been a career Army and colonel, so we didn't question it. Then the funeral came, and they went all out. Huge procession. People showing up who are really big names, like the heads of departments, senators, retired senators, people from the CIA and State Department. It was nuts and we were all super confused. Turns out he was a key dude in the OSI during World War II, and when the OSI splintered into the CIA and Secret Service, he went with the Secret Service route. He wasn't on White House detail, but instead worked in a covert office that dealt with counterfeiting and currency. He went blind when I was a toddler and retired from the Army. For whatever reason, he told no one about all his covert work with the OSI and Secret Service, and the only person who knew, my grandmother, was sworn to secrecy and never told anyone. My father grew up thinking he was just a colonel working on the base. Only after his death were we given all sorts of cool shit, like publications by him, lectures given by him, and all kinds of things from various things he did and was known for. All I knew him as was a blind old man who was perpetually smoking, drinking, and being a crotchety bastard. Turns out he was a bad motherfucker, and all but none of us knew. In the 1970s, a dead girl was found on my grandpa's property. Everyone, including the local police, just assumed she was in with a bad crowd and murdered by drug dealers. In the 90s, some of his grandkids came forward about all the molestation. After that, people started to realize Grandpa probably killed that girl. What? Who molested her though? Grandpa? Yeah, my grandpa was molesting all his granddaughters, and with some, he'd threatened to kill them if they told anybody. So we think he probably was the one who killed the dead girl they found behind his house. But he was well liked in a small town. One of his sons was a state senator running for governor, so I don't know if people were paid off or what. I see a lot of stories about people finding out that who they thought was their parents weren't the people raising them, and this one is a bit different. My dad always thought his father who raised him wasn't his bio dad, and the father thought the same. He was treated terribly by his father because the father was told he couldn't have children. And my father was born prematurely, but at a healthy weight, so everyone assumed my grandmother had an affair and got pregnant with my dad. It was to the point that after my grandmother died, my grandfather failed to even mention to his new wife that he had a son and grandchild, me. Years later, my dad gets an ancestry DNA test for him and me. He finds out that his dad was actually his bio dad. It was shocking and sad. My uncles are infamous criminals who killed multiple people. I thought they bred dogs. My great-grandfather didn't die of cancer. He died from complications after being shot when one of his businesses was being robbed. Maybe. He also spent a lot of time in Atlantic City. He also had a lot of partners in the Teamsters and other unions in coal country. Also, everyone called him Smiling Tony, but his name wasn't Tony. He died in the 60s, long before my time. When my great-grandmother died 20 years ago, a very old guy showed up to the funeral in a white suit, and all of the oldest people in my family kissed his hand. When I asked, no one knew who he was. My grandfather moved his family away from Central PA in the late 60s and disconnected from all of this, but there it is. The scars on an elder family member's wrist were not from a botched suicide. They were from her mom trying to protect herself and her kids from the approaching Red Army. This was at the end of World War II in Germany. This made it so much worse. After I was molested by my uncle, it came out that he had done this to another one of my sisters, and my family covered it up, particularly my mother. Now I know why my sisters didn't like how close my uncle got to me when I was younger. It's never just one victim, which is why it's especially terrible to cover it up. This person isn't lying. I came out to my mom after the fact that a family member had molested me and a brother of mine, and it turns out that he had did this to 4 or 5 children, including me. So if you've been molested, I encourage you to tell somebody, because it's not just your sanity and safety at stake, but chances are it's someone close to you as well. My grandmother recently died. She was famous in our town for her amazing cooking and catering, in particularly our turkey dinners. Notably, her gravy was absolutely amazing, so delicious. She had a heart attack several years ago, and her near-death experience convinced her to share some of her secret recipes with me, all except her gravy recipe. When she died this spring, I was going through her pantry and found an entire bucket of KFC gravy mix. She was literally using KFC gravy mix as a base to make her incredible gravy. Huge scandal. Bacon gravy has got to be the most charming family secret out of all the horrible shit in this thread. My grandfather was an atomic soldier. Instead of sending him to fight in the Korean War, they sent him to Nevada, where, after having him turn away from the initial flash, he witnessed the mushroom cloud. After that was over, he was ordered to march to the detonation point, where he was unwittingly exposed to high amounts of radiation. Luckily for my family, my grandfather is now in his 90s, even after a few cancer scares. And the rest of us, my mom, aunt, cousins, sisters, and I, are cancer-free and fairly healthy. But this is medical information that we really should have known earlier. I remember watching a documentary about sailors who were made to experience an atomic blast. They sat on the deck of a ship while it was blasted out at sea. The old man said he put his hand in front of his closed eyes to shield them, but could still see the bones in his hand like an X-ray through his skin and eyelids. Then they brought those ships back to San Francisco to clean them, which was basically stripping off the paint and burying it in the ground, still dealing with the contamination to this day. My grandma didn't drive. I thought she couldn't, but it was never discussed. One day when I was maybe 7 or 8, I'd been trying to get anyone, to drive me to the store for candy. We were visiting my aunt and uncle. Grandma lived with them. They had Bitto honey at the local store, which I could no longer get at home, but no one would take me to the store. Finally, I said I'd just ask Grandma, and my cousin chimes in with, "Grandma can't drive." "Oh, you bet your sweet ass I can drive. They just don't let me." Grandma had overheard, and she was in high dudgeon. But that's all that was said about it. And my aunt finally took me to the store, so I forgot about it. Years later, when I'd just gotten my license, I asked my mom what was up with Grandma not driving. She explained that during Prohibition, Grandma bootlegged alcohol for moonshiners. She was very successful at it. She was so successful at it that when the moonshiners were finally busted, even though the revenuers never caught my grandma, her license was suspended by the state to never be reissued. Later in life, she was told that she could petition for it back, but it came with an admission of guilt or some such. She told him to go to hell. As a young teenager, my grandma shot her pedophile father in the back while he was sleeping. He had been molesting her and all her siblings. She ran away after being hidden by her brother for some time. Her father survived though. Thankfully, my grandma never faced any legal consequences, but she was batshit crazy until the day she died. My aunt told me at her funeral because I asked why grandma was the way she was. One of my former employees told me the story of her wife. Wife shot and killed her dad when she was a teen. He had been molesting her and her sister, but judge and jury didn't see it as self-defense since he was sleeping when she shot him. She served time in prison for the murder, but got out and had her record expunged due to various circumstances, including inadequate counsel from a public defender. Then she went to law school, graduated at the top of her class, and is now a lawyer in a large metro area and does a ton of pro bono work for kids in similar situations. I started having problems with my teeth, spontaneous abscesses that resulted in multiple root canals. My dentist did some looking into what the cause might be and found some really odd abnormalities with my incisor roots and nerves, the teeth that had been afflicting me. So he sent out requests for help to a couple of professors he knew in the field. When my next appointment came, he was really quiet for a bit before verbally stumbling about. It turns out that what was happening to my teeth was a classic sign of inbreeding, and he was super uncomfortable giving me the news. I brought it up to my mom, and she was just like, "Oh, well, yeah. Didn't you know?" What the fuck? Of course I didn't know. Turns out that not very far back in the family tree, several of my relatives decided that it was a good idea to marry one another, and no one bothered to mention it, ever. The small town where I live is 85% my relatives. No joke. I hadn't even met all of them, that's how many there are. I had made a big point of going far away from my hometown to meet my husband, married 12 years this June, because I was afraid of having children with somebody that might be my cousin, only to find out 5 years after we had been married that I was in fact a product of inbreeding. My husband and I are not related at all. Relative did not just fall off a bridge with her baby, she jumped. It seems obvious in hindsight, but they reported it differently, both in the news and to younger family members. I used to work in a field dealing with suicide prevention. Even though some may see the passing as a result of suicide, a lot of family members and loved ones have a very difficult time coping with the idea that the victim passed due to these circumstances, especially when children are involved. This is not uncommon to report differently, as it is not something a lot of families are able to come to terms with, and understandably. I am really sorry to hear about your relative, though, and I hope some of the wounds have somewhat healed over time. I've heard that with autoerotic asphyxiation, the family is more likely to report it as suicide because the truth is too embarrassing. Interesting to see how people cope with death so differently. That'll conclude today's Ask Reddit episode. Thank you so much for coming on this journey with me. If you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Until next time.